Good afternoon. Today is March 29th, 2011. I'm Greg Lockhart with the Blue Island Chamber of Commerce, and we're live on WDDE Channel 4 in Blue Island. Our guest today is none other than JoeGatrell, and it's kind of a pleasure that an interviewer gets to interview a fellow interviewer. So, as I understand it, there's a great book that the Historical Society has called The First 100 Years, and that covers 1835, the beginning of Blue Island, to 1935. And Joe is in the process of researching and writing, what, the next 100 years?
We could call it the next 100 years, Greg. It's going to be 1934 on. The title of the book is Just the Way Things Were, A Political History of Blue Island.
And so that's only going to be 8 or 10 pages, right?
You know, Greg, I laugh because the intro, which is how John Hart became mayor, started out to be a couple of pages and turned into 10,000 words.
I see.
That's just the opening chapter on how Hart became mayor. So you can imagine, I'm working on a chapter about Harry Harzak. Harry was mayor for 11 months. I thought it would be a couple of pages. Harry's up to 11,000 words. Now, I've been known to be wordy, but I can't be wordy unless I have the info.
Get out the red pencil for
that. But there's just that much information.
All right, so let's go back to Mayor Hart. Now, I understand he owned Hart's Drugstore, which is currently Flowers by Kathy. He lived on New Street, about 24 whatever.
In front of the fake fire hydrant.
Yes, which the fire department is informed me is currently functioning.
It's real now, yeah.
Yes, it's real, so you can't park near it. But when did he become mayor?
Well, and just to go back to where you began, I believe he bought the drugstore in 1923 from Harry Dare and actually rented the location, didn't own it until the owner passed away years later. John Hart was elected out of exasperation in April, I believe it was April 16, 1937. And a very interesting story is how John became mayor because the city just got itself into such incredible debt, six-figure debt, that they wanted someone to come in and, I'm using my fingers for quotation marks, save Blue Island from itself, I guess, Greg, because it couldn't stop accumulating debt. So John Hart said, we're going to run it like a business. John Hart didn't actually say pay-as-you-go. That was someone else's slogan. He borrowed it, like he borrowed many other things along the way.
But not money.
I didn't say that.
Okay. So how long did his...
He didn't let the city borrow money. Let me put it that way.
How long did his term run? Up into the 60s?
John Hart has been the longest-serving mayor on the books, 28 years, 1937 to 65. And if Donald Poloquin, our current mayor, is reelected in 13, he will become the longest-serving mayor. This is Mayor Poloquin's 7th term. Hart had 7 full terms.
So, what went on under Mayor Hart's term?
What didn't go on? I almost don't know where to begin with that one. Well, and you talked about he didn't borrow, and I mentioned pay as you go, and he did under his direction. The city did get out of debt, and Hart immediately began to run the city like a business, but not just like a business, but like his business. And it was whatever John Hart wanted, and he ran his business with a very, very tight fist. So while on paper the city was always in the black, he didn't spend money on some very necessary projects. So the stubborn old Germans that ran Blue Island for a century and longer than a century, were very happy because we got out of debt, we didn't go back into the red. However, we didn't get new sewer systems.
So it's infrastructure, things that didn't get
maintained
like they should be.
We didn't become a modern metropolis. We didn't annex lands to the west for, we were talking off camera. There are rumors that we could have had land all the way to 127th and Southwest Highway into Palos Heights. John Hart's philosophy was Blue Island was never going to grow outward. Legend has it that he envisioned Blue Island was going to have skyscrapers. It was going to grow upward. And didn't you talk to me before about all these apartments we have? Our wonderful apartments?
Well, I was thinking maybe the permit fees are what he used to get the city out of debt.
He might have used the permit fees. He didn't use them to get the city out of debt. Actually, I believe the apartment explosion took place starting in the 50s. But that seemed like it was part of his philosophy, to have multi-unit buildings growing up or in short spaces. But he had a chance to annex the Clark oil refinery land. Didn't want to do it. The area all the way to Kedzie, between the canal and maybe 119th Street. That whole area along all the way to, I take that back, to Pulaski. Didn't want to do it.
And that's also partially.
Yeah, well, also Mayor Tremundi said, hey, this looks like a pretty good deal. So actually Hart and Tremundi were friends, but much different philosophies.
So that's one of the early chapters. Who is the mayor that succeeded Mayor Hart?
Well, in 1965, Richard Withers was really a reform candidate. Lifelong Blue Islander.
Now, he owned, I think, a lighting company?
Actually, he owned a school supply company, and I believe it started as things like bulbs for overhead projectors.
Was that
and projectors?
Was he involved with Howard Wilson with that?
You know, I don't know if he was involved with Howard Wilson.
Because I think he made his fortune with overhead projectors. Maybe it was the equipment rather than the bulbs.
I believe Mayor Withers was the bulbs. The name of the company was Visualcraft. And I believe his brother Bob and he started it actually first in their basement. Then I believe they built a place on Union Street just west of the tracks there, down the hill from Highland Square.
Oh.
And they ran it out of there for years. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar international business.
Really?
It's beyond overhead projector bulbs, and obviously there are no more projectors. So now he deals with China and Japan. But getting back to how he became mayor, he really was a reform candidate. He really was a reform alderman. He was elected in '63 to the city council. And what he told me was he didn't like the way the town was being run under Mayor Hart. And as it just so happened, in the 1965 election, you had 4 candidates. You had 2 old-timers, Mayor Hart, who at that time was almost 70 years old. And then you had Michael Guglielmucci, who actually helped Hart get elected in 1937. And then you had Lloyd Homlin. Now, why the head of the chamber that was a friend of Hart's decided he was going to run. And then you had this young guy, Dick Withers, who I believe was like 34 or 35 at the time. Homlin got maybe 170 votes. But Guglielmucci and Hart split about 5,000 votes. So they each got about 2,500, maybe a little less. Withers got 3,000, and the split vote put Withers in office. So he was in for 12 years. Worked out very well. And Dick Withers really was the reform candidate. He started pumping life back into Western Avenue. So we know the term business revitalization. That actually came from Dick Withers. The facades came from Dick Withers. The Western Avenue project, where we used to have two-way Western, now we have one-way Western, came out of a redoing of the sewer system is where it started. And his political connection with Richard Ogilvie, who became the governor. That's how we got all paid for by the state. Blue Island didn't pay for that. So that all came from Dick Withers.
So did it go one way under his watch?
It finished up at the end of the Withers administration in 77, 78, and at the beginning of the Harzak administration. So it became a political issue. Dick Withers changed Western so that it was modern, and then they used it against him in the 77 election campaign to help him be defeated. And one of Harry Harzak's campaign promises was, I'm going to try to get Western changed back to two-way, because people, again, traditional, conservative, German, Republican town, we don't want any changes ever. Okay, we'd still have the Liederkranz Society. Okay, we might be wearing lederhosen, Greg, I don't know. But they wanted to get a change back. The deal was, we're going to do this, and now you're not going to change it back. So Harry wasn't able to get a change back, in my opinion, thank goodness. Interesting note about Chris DeSabato.
DeSabato.
DeSabato, okay, I'm sorry.
the other branch of the family has disobeyed.
Okay. Chris was an alderman at the time, and one of the things the state also said was no parking on Western Avenue. Can you imagine no parking from virtually 115th Street all the way through Blue Island to Posen? The business people were going crazy. Chris almost single-handedly got with IDOT when nobody else was interested and got these guys by the collar and made them agree that parking would be okay. So because of Chris DeSabato, we have parking on Western today.
Good job.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me saying, I was on the way over here, and I rode my bike, and I was going down Western. And this is an issue that's been going on, that's been festering for as long as there have been cars in Blue Island. Should business owners park their cars?
Absolutely not.
You and I say not, and logic says not. Greg, I was here today, and as I went down Western Avenue between 127th and the library, business owners had their cars parked in front of their businesses. I know one business, one office, had 3 different people with their cars in front of their business. Took up almost the whole block.
And
these
where
dumbasses,
do the customers park?
where these people ought
They
to
go
be,
around the block and they go to Beverly and shop elsewhere.
they ought to be horsewhipped.
Yes.
That these
And
lazy
I'll provide
asses,
the horse and the whipping.
they cannot walk 100 feet parking their cars across the street or down the block. So customers of all the shops can park there. But now we're going back to stubborn Germans that can't agree with each other. The same thing that was true in 1900 is true in 2011. Blue Island can't make those kinds of decisions. It's incredible. So, sorry to interrupt.
That's quite right. Let's go back to Mayor Hart for a second. I understand he was kidnapped not just once, but multiple times.
Now, actually, Hart was kidnapped once. Jim
Oh.
Hackett, the gambling boss, was kidnapped twice.
Oh.
Yeah, and there are people in Blue Island that still say they don't believe Hart was really kidnapped. They think it was a hoax. So,
A little publicity stunt or...
needed attention. Greg, unfortunately, one of the last people that may really know passed away last week, Marvin Olina, who was on the police force in 1967. Hart was kidnapped maybe October 13th, 1967. Was missing for 26 days. Turned up as mysteriously as he disappeared. Fresh as a daisy. Here's a 75-year-old man, or however old he was at the time. Didn't have a scratch on him. Clean scrubbed. Had fresh, clean underclothing on.
Were there ransom attempts, or
Greg,
what was the purpose of this?
The few things, the little that Mayor Hart told people about this was he was driving on in the vicinity of Vermont and Chicago Avenue, okay, on a Friday afternoon, Friday the 13th, just so happened to be. He had gone to the First National Bank to cash in some bonds. They didn't have enough cash on hand to redeem the bonds. Supposedly they were school bonds that he had financed. So they said, come back the next day, we'll have your cash for you. So he left. So he's got the bonds on him. The bonds are supposedly a key part of the story. So he's driving down, Vermont Street, and from out of nowhere, these 2 guys come along and waylay him. Now, they come up behind him, put their hands over his eyes. He never sees them for 26 days. That's what he said. They took him somewhere in Dixmoor, tied him to a chair for 26 days, blindfolded for 26 days, fed him baby food and soft-boiled eggs. And again, I want to emphasize, he never saw him and knew his abductors. And after 26 days, he allegedly turned up in front of Ingalls Hospital in Harvey, fresh as a daisy, like nothing ever happened. And that was pretty much all John Hart ever said about it. And another interesting thing, I mentioned Harry Harzak. Harry Harzak was in charge of the investigation. And Marvin Olina also was involved in the investigation. Unfortunately, Harry passed away a few years ago. Marv just passed away last week, the former police chief. I was hoping to talk to Marv. Marv always stonewalled my request for interviews. He did not want to be interviewed. Marv had a reputation. So all the files on this have disappeared. There are no files in the Blue Island.
And there's no one alive that can tell you what happened.
Greg, I'd like to think there's somebody out there that can tell me what really happened. But I have not come across that person. So I'm going to make an appeal. If anybody knows the real details of the John Hart kidnapping, please contact me. You can reach me at 708-388-9033 or at my email address, JoeGatrell@att.net. Anything pertaining to this book you think you might have some information, love to hear from them.
We'll check with Harry Robertson later. He may have some insight.
Harry has got some information, but he, unfortunately, he's emphatic. He doesn't have anything direct. Harry was quite a bit younger than Mayor Hart and really wasn't a, close associate, but he did have some good Hart stories. And some good Pape Definelli stories, too.
Great. So what, as you get into the later years, so we had Mayor Hart, Harry Harzak.
Well, Hart, Withers.
Oh, Withers, I'm sorry.
Harzak, it's an interesting story about how Withers got out and Harzak got in. It seems like Mayor Withers really, his business was just starting to take off. And as I look back at the city council minutes and the old Sun Standard clippings and talk to people, it seems like running for that fourth term, he really wasn't into it. He wasn't interested. And I've heard rumblings that he had to be talked into it. Now, Harry, on the other hand, never been in politics, was Withers' police chief. Supposedly hated Marv Olina. That was Withers' then police chief. So somebody put Harry up to run against Withers because he was the only guy that could beat Withers. And part of the motivation for Harry was he hated Marv Olina and he wanted to get rid of Marv, which, Greg, this is really interesting. Harry was elected maybe April 19th, 1977, had himself sworn in a week later before a city council meeting took place, went over to the police station at 12:01 a.m., fired Marv, and appointed Dick Coinga the police chief without city council approval. Man, did it hit the fan after that. Wow. You talk about wars. Man, the alderman and the mayor really started butting heads after that. We were in all the papers. We had two police chiefs, because Marv wouldn't leave, and Coinga wouldn't leave. Then he also fired the city attorney, Edwin Richardson, and Earl Ebers was installed, so now neither of those guys was going to leave. So for a month or more, two police chiefs, two attorneys, were in the papers, were on the news, were a laughingstock.
And they didn't reverse any of that?
Well, what happened was, to make full-time appointments, you have to have city council approval. So they made a deal by which Marv would retire, the previous city attorney would resign, and then the new ones would be voted on and approved. Because the alderman said, we really don't have any problem with these guys. Earl Ebers was a lifelong resident. Everybody knew Dick Coinga. And so, and actually the alderman didn't like Marv anyway. Marv had a really bad reputation. And actually, Marv's reputation probably cost Dick Withers the election. So nobody was sad to see Marv go. But there were some other things after that, Greg, that really caused some problems for Harry. There was an alleged meat scandal that somebody that was out to get him and maybe get him to resign started some falsehoods about him, started some rumors that, Harry was in the meat business on the side. So a mobster that didn't like Harry and an axe to grind started a rumor Harry bought and sold stolen meat. So the rumors all over Blue Island. This is one of the things that drove Harry from office after only 11 months in the executive's chair.
That's it, less than a year, huh?
11 months, he couldn't, supposedly threw the keys on the desk one day and said, that's it, I quit. Never came back. Never even attended his last city council meeting.
So does the council then appoint a successor? They don't have an election for that, do they?
Both. What happened was they get to a point, and then they have to designate a date for a special election. So Chris DeSabato became mayor.
Oh, like mayor pro tem because he was...
Yeah. He actually was the mayor pro tem, but then there was a vote to make him acting mayor. So he became mayor in maybe March 11th or March 13th, 1978. The special election was held July 25th, 1978. I mentioned earlier, somebody wanted to get Harry out, somebody wanted to be mayor. Guess who ran against Chris? John Rita.
And so he had been an alderman from the east side?
He was elected in 63 and was one of the 3rd Ward aldermen all the way to 78. And that 3rd Ward at that time was a behemoth. And it had 13,000 votes in there, 1,300 votes in there. And just as it did in the Withers-Harzak election, hurt Withers, the 3rd Ward was the whole thing in the Rita DeSabato election. Chris lost by 319 votes. It was the 3rd Ward beat him. So he had great turnout in his 2nd Ward, but the 3rd Ward was too much. So John Rita became mayor in 78, finished Harry's term, was elected 1 more term in 81, and was mayor until 85. Man, there were some fireworks then.
And that's when Don Poloquin, who had been an alderman, challenged him. Any story behind that at all? Or?
Yeah, well, actually there are quite a few stories. John Rita, people tell me, Greg, when I ask about John Rita, they'll look back and they'll say, Joe, I helped John Rita get elected. And then John Rita thought he was king, and he forgot all about me. So all those people that John Rita cultivated in 78 and again in 81, by 85, he'd alienated all of them. And he really could have been king. I mean, John Rita could have been mayor of Blue Island as long as he lived. But he just upset so many people. He even alienated his own people. And so now here comes this nobody, this unknown, Don Poloquin. He was a 1-term alderman that actually was installed by John Rita. Rita put him on the Civil Service Commission. Rita cultivated him to run for alderman. And finally, by 1985, even his own people, like Poloquin, were turned off. So he said, I'm going to run against you. And supposedly, now I said, a campaign issue, Marvolina, in the 77 election. The campaign issue for Poloquin in 85 was Dick Coinga.
And he was police chief at the
time? He was the
time?
police chief. And supposedly Poloquin wanted Coinga out. Now, there may be a little bit more to it than that, as to who he wanted in or who he wanted promoted. But, Rita wasn't, Coinga was very loyal to Rita and did a lot of things for Rita, so Rita was not going to get rid of Coinga. And he figured, this kid can't beat me. And he didn't figure correctly. So Poloquin beat him in 85, and he beat him again in 89. And then John Rita pretty much disappeared, and we've had Don Poloquin ever since.
Now, I remember Dennis Greaves in the late 80s. Was that Poloquin's first police chief?
Dennis Greaves had a hand in 3 mayors. He helped defeat Withers. So he got in Harzak. That's 2. So now, I said there was something a little bit more than Coinga. The problem between Withers and Greaves was number 1 on the police department hiring list in 1976. For some reason, Dick Withers and/or Chief Marvolina did not want to hire Dennis Greaves. Paul Dennis Greaves was his name. So he's number 1 on the list. He goes to court. He wins the court case. The court tells Blue Island, you must hire Dennis Greaves. The Blue Island Civil Service Commission tells the city, you must hire Greaves. They still won't do it. Finally, they get the city attorney to announce, well, we checked the appropriations ordinance, and there's not enough money, and there's no designation for another hire, so we're not going to hire him. But then they went around, then they hired somebody over him. They hired a guy named Joe Baskis. Not political, but so they bypassed him. So now Greaves says, this is enough. What should I do? A friend tells him, why don't you run for alderman in 77? Then you can make him put you on the city council. So that's what he did. Dennis Greaves was a very popular guy. He got that 1st ward overwhelmingly for himself and won, and for Harry. So that's also, he helped Harry get in. So he gets on the police force. Now he's a patrolman for, he gets on in 77, because he was only an alderman for like a month, and he resigned, Harry put him on the force. So he's on the force from 78 until almost 85, and he gets married, and he and his wife are talking, and his wife keeps asking him, hey, you know what? You're a little too good to be just a patrolman. When are you going to be a sergeant? When are you going to get some stripes? They're both kind of ambitious. So he goes to John Rita, and he says, I just want a couple of stripes. When can I get a promotion? And he was a good officer. So at that time, Rita's city attorney was a guy named Bill Ostick, who was a daily in-law. And John Rita loved this guy, Bill Ostick, because he was a daily in-law. So So Bill Ostick had a lot of sway with John Rita. Well, now that Dennis Greaves is no longer in politics, he's a cop, he's not out campaigning, so Bill Ostick says, the heck with him. What's he ever done for us? We're not giving him any stripes. He's a nobody. So he tells Greaves no. So now Greaves aligns himself with Poloquin. You run for mayor against this guy and I'll campaign for you. So now Poloquin goes to Rita and says, we just want this guy Greaves to get a couple of stripes. He's a good cop. Can you make him a sergeant? Bill Ostick and John Rita, no way. If you don't do it, I'm going to run against you. We're not doing it. He ran against him and beat him. Greaves goes from patrolman
to chief?
To chief.
Not a bad promotion.
It's who you know. But actually, he was a pretty good chief. Mm-hmm. So now he's living in Arizona. He's in real estate. He's been retired for many years. He and his wife. They just were in Blue Island. We sat down to breakfast at the Marv's. Great guy. Very interesting to talk to. And interesting, Larry Petta and John Rita were like this. And Larry Petta was at that breakfast, and he said, he told Greaves, had we listened, and Larry said, I told John, give this guy a couple of stripes. Had John listened, John would have still been mayor. Poloquin would have never been mayor. John would not listen. Took advice from the wrong guy. True story.
So these are some of the tidbits about your upcoming book.
Yep. And there's plenty more, everybody, so when the book comes out, you can still buy it.
And when do you expect to have this book ready?
Well, I've been researching for about 11 months. I had thought I would do a couple of months of research and then get to the writing and be done by now. But the more I find, the more it leads me to. So I've probably finished about 7 chapters. I finished many of the hard chapters. I'm working on the Harry Harzak chapter, which I told you started out to be a couple of pages and is now 11,000 words. I'm going to finish the Harry chapter this week, and I've still got Withers and Poloquin to do, and Rita. So I would say by the end of this year, I would hope to have it to a publisher and then in print. Keep your fingers crossed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I just want to appeal one more time. Anybody out there has information that they think could be useful. A political history of Blue Island, just the way things work. Let me give you a couple of names. Hart's secretary, a great woman. Her name was Olga Pukala. She lived into her 90s in Blue Island, and she passed away within the last couple of years. Now, she's got to have some relatives out there. Okay, what happened to all of her scrapbooks, mementos? Somebody out there knows Olga Pukala or her family. If you could you contact me? Because I would love to see some of that stuff and get some of those recollections. There's still people out there, besides Harry Robertson and a couple others, and Jackson East was somebody, and Larry Petta was somebody, that remember John Hart and Dick Withers and John Rita. I want to talk to these people and get their recollections. So, again, 708-388-9033 or my name, JoeGatrell at att.net. Don't hesitate to contact me. Your information will be kept confidential if that's the way you prefer it. What do you think, Craig?
Yeah, let me throw in one story that I heard from one of the people we mentioned earlier.
Go right ahead.
I think it was when Mayor Hart was mayor. He said the police chief had a vest, I think, or a jacket, and sewn into the interior lining. I'm not sure how many wards were how many bars were in Blue Island at the time. Let's say 50, and that might have been the number.
That's the number.
He had a little pocket for each of the 50 taverns, and then the police chief every week would go in and visit and say, we need our, protection money is one way to put it.
Yeah.
And he'd stuff it in there and then go to the next one.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And if somebody didn't pay up, the next week is doubly.
Yeah. John Hart was a great entrepreneur. And so, I think that chief might have been McAvoy. Is that what you heard?
I don't recall the name.
Yeah. And so many of John's chiefs and drivers were bagmen and collectors. And, not that John didn't ever collect on his own, but, John Hart died. John Hart was a corner druggist, and he was the mayor of a town. At that time, it wasn't a small town. Probably never was a small town, but probably never made more. The mayor's salary probably never was more than $5,000 while he was mayor, and he might have gotten another 12 or 15 being the liquor commissioner. And yet he died a multi-millionaire. So how did that mayor druggist get all that money?
One can only
Yep.
imagine.
Perhaps that will be in the book. But he was quite an entrepreneur and loved to play cards also. He
And
was
that
an
would be at
avid-
the VFW Hall, which is now 911.
Everywhere. The Elks, which used to be next door, was another place. I already had a regular game where we would accept gratuities. And I heard that on occasion he even had a poker game at the police station, the old police station. So, you know, he did not discriminate at many venues for John M. Hart.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, Joe, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today and tell us a little bit about your
Greg,
soon-to-be-published fascinating book.
just the way things were, because I heard that phrase from so many people that knew the era. They said, they would tell me a story, and I'd be amazed, and they would say, Joe, that was just the way things were. As if that whitewashed it, that made it okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope, Greg, by the end of 2011, I'm typing as fast as I can, and I'll keep you informed on this.
Very good. All right, Greg Lockhouse signing off. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
That's just the way things work.
Yes, they were.